So, thus the knife fighting thing. And Bowie was certainly not the only knife fighter of note. Golly, there was a guy in East Texas named Henry Strickland who was the bully of the Tennehaw, he was called. And he got killed when a guy hit him in the head with a rifle butt in a brawl. But you get the picture. Knife fighter country. And I've always thought this. Had Bowie, with his habits, lived in the Old West, the later West, when there are revolving pistols, he would have been a renowned gunfighter. And had Wild Bill Hickok, let us say, lived in the earlier period, he would have been quite a knife fighter, I think. But there's another element to this technology, and it certainly developed here in Texas, was important throughout the rest of the West. We here in Texas, we were the first Anglo settlers to encounter Comanche Indians, who were superb horsemen, and they had a repeating weapon that they could use from horseback. They used the short bow, which was very powerful when drawn back to the ear. They did not have to have their hands to handle their horses. They guided their horses with their knees. They carried a quiver of arrows, 15, 18, 20, over their shoulder or perhaps around their hip. And they had learned to do this when hunting buffalo, but they could also fight other warriors, and then in Texas, Spaniards and Mexican soldados, and of course, Anglo settlers with these things. What they would do is stay just out of musket range. That's what the Spanish and the Mexican soldados had. And they would taunt them with a few choice words in Spanish about their mothers. Then when they would fire, now the effective range of a musket isn't but about 50 yards or so. And they would be on those quick grass-fed ponies, and as soon as the muskets, the escopetas, were fired, here they came at the gallop. And while you're still trying to do all this stuff with your shoulder gun, powder shot, ramrod, and so forth, they're all over you, filling you with arrows. And they stymied us when we got here. The Anglo settlers came here with the same kind of weaponry, except we did have rifles, and those rifles were effective for at least 150 yards, so we could hold them at bay, but we could not fight them from horseback. You could not reload one of those 5 to 6 foot rifles from horse. And yes, we had horse pistols, but they were these single shot jobs. You carried them in a holster that had a flap on it. Keep your powder dry, they always said. By the way, there's another saying about these old firearms that might be worth repeating here. Everybody's heard the saying, keep your powder dry, and ladies are not just talking about makeup, they're talking about the gunpowder. And lock, stock, and barrel. Those old gunsmiths had to make the lock, which is the trigger and hammer mechanism, part of it out of sight. That's the lock. The stock is the barrel, where they're the stock is the wooden part, whether it be this part on a pistol or a much larger part on a shoulder gun. And of course, lock, stock, and barrel, this is the barrel. You had to make those 3 parts. That's where that came from. And so we would have a horse pistol, or perhaps 2, in a holster to keep the powder dry on the front of your saddle. So you had a shoulder gun, you had 1 shot, then you had a second shot, and then you got filled with arrows by the warrior who had 18 shots. And we had to do something about that. Well, the guy that did it wasn't a Texan, but boy, we made his fame and fortune. Samuel Colt was a teenager when he went to sea. The great adventure of that day, the great adventure of a later day, of course, would be cowboying, going up the trail. But in his day, it was going to sea. And at sea, he noticed, now he's on a big merchant ship, at sea, he noticed that the tiller drum, now he was not on a yacht, he was on a big merchant ship that had a tiller drum with ropes around it that went down and guided the tiller. And then he had the rudder, and then on the front of the tiller drum was a big stand-up wheel, and on the back was another, so that in stormy weather you could actually have 4 helmsmen, both of them struggling with the 2 of them struggling with the front, 2 with the back. And if you wanted to go, let's say 2 points to starboard, well, listen to this. Click, click. 2 points to starboard, or 2 points to larboard, or whatever. And he got to thinking about that, and that's when he came up with the idea of the revolving pistol. His gun would be small and rather awkward, but the caliber was only 28 caliber, and some of them were 31 calibers. And it was so small that it was a 5-shooter. And it was very awkward to reload. You had to pull the barrel off and the handle and so forth. It did not have a trigger guard on it. But it would shoot 5 times. And some of them came into Texas hands during the Republic period. And Texas Ranger Captain Jack Hayes. Captain Hayes had a small company of men, and they were trying to battle Comanche war parties, and he saw in this a tactical way to deal with this. This weapon would give Texas Rangers a weapon that would fire multiple times, just as the bow and arrow could fire multiple times, both of them from horseback. And he trained his men. He made sure that his men each had a brace of these guns, two at least, plus their rifle. And he went hunting a war party, and he found one of 70 to 80 men. And he only had 15, and the Comanches did their usual thing. They hung somewhat out of range. They were not really out of range of those great rifles they had. But Hayes said, empty some saddles, boys, and sure enough they did. And now the Comanches thought, we've got them. And here they came. At that point, these men, by training, discarded their rifles, drew their first pistol. Remember, they had 2, and they began to ride toward the Comanches. That was odd. They never had seen that before. They fired 1 shot, and then they fired a second shot. And boy, did that mess up their medicine. And it turned into a running fight, and Captain Hayes hollered, powder burn them, boys. He wanted them to close with them. It's hard to hit anything from a galloping horse. And they hit well over half of those were killed or wounded. And that was a real turning point in the history of the West, because the Army's going to accept that. And so the Texas Rangers began to work with this in various Indian fights. And then about 2 years after that, we got into a war with Mexico.